My name is Dr. Phil Winiarka. I'm a senior college lecturer here in the Department of Anthropology at Cleveland State University. And we conducted an archaeological field school this past summer at Hale Farm and Village in Bath, Ohio. Um, the Hale Farm people contacted me in the spring and asked if I'd be interested in doing some archaeological explorations in and around Hale. The Hale property was home to one of the very first settlers in the early 1800s who arrived in this portion of the Western Reserve. And so in 1810, I believe, Jonathan Hale arrived to Bath and built a log cabin and lived there for a while and was really the first person in this area. The Cleveland Museum of Natural History conducted archaeological investigations in the 70s and early 80s there and found quite a bit of prehistoric materials. But the new directors at the Hale Farm and Village, along with the Western Reserve Historical Society, who basically owns and oversees Hale Farm, wanted more contemporary information about the history. That includes both the prehistory and the historic period of their property. So they asked if I would be interested in doing some archaeological explorations in and around the park, and I said sure. So we set up I applied for a permit to work there with them, in which we sort of were going to excavate, shovel test a variety of fields on the west side of Oak Hill Road. And it ended up being a job that was way more than what we could really count for. We had planned to dig several hundred, 600 or 700 shovel tests. These are round holes, maybe 20 to 30 centimeters across and about maybe anywhere between 30 and 50 centimeters deep, in which we dig every 15 meters across a parcel of land. So we chose one parcel to begin this survey. It's going to be a multi-year project, but we chose this field. We called it field number 4, which is the field just south of the visitor center, and it's a big field. We ended up digging almost 180 shovel tests in that field. We found just over 625 objects, none of which really were all that exciting, unfortunately. We found lots of historic materials, nails and glass and other modern materials, but not much in terms of prehistoric. So, people get disappointed in not knowing where the prehistoric is, or not finding the prehistoric materials. And what I always argue and tell people that, we know where they weren't living rather than not finding much. And it tells us just as much that they weren't there. We had heard through background research that I have been conducting that there was a large Native American village in and around this area. This area where Hale Farm is one of the largest open valleys in the southern part of the Cuyahoga Valley. And it's likely that this was a spot for a Native American village site at some point in the past. And we didn't find it, so we didn't find any evidence of that there, at least in the areas that we're digging. We're hopeful for next season because we know there's going to be more, there is prehistoric materials around the actual Hale homestead itself. So when we start our field school, we always start back in the lab here at Cleveland State University, where we give a general overview of what we're going to do with the students, so the students have an idea of what they're in for. I assign equipment to everybody. Everyone gets equipment to use in the field. And again, we see several PowerPoints and lectures on identifying artifacts, what to look for, how we're going to excavate in the field, and the kinds of things, the mundane things, what you need to wear, what you don't need to wear, and the everyday things that you need for these projects. So the students have a really good idea coming into what can be expected. So as I mentioned, the normal practice, we call this a phase 1 archaeological inventory. And what we do is we set up a grid. The normal state regulations, I guess, would be we dig between sort of a 30 and 50 centimeter hole, about that big, and we dig it down to sterile subsoil. So we take that dirt, we throw it into a screen, and we screen all of that material, looking for any kind of cultural material, whether it's prehistoric or historic materials. We inventory it, we write it out on excavation forms describing what we found and how deep the holes were. so that when we could go back and say, maybe we found a large concentration of historic materials here, and maybe a large concentration of prehistoric materials there, that if we wanted to go explore those concentrations later with opening up larger test units in and around those areas, we could do that. And so this is sort of the standard way that we do inventory testing in and around properties in Ohio. We found it's very surreptitious. Archaeology is, you never know what you're going to find. Very often it's on the last day when you find all these goodies, and then you're like, oh no, how do we continue on? But in this case, we decided that we were going to start excavating this field from the east side to the west side. And that very first day, we found a projectile point, lo and behold, which was pretty amazing. It was in a field across the street, not really in our survey area. We were just walking it because the field was plowed. And one of our students found a triangular projectile point. We call it Madison projectile point. And it basically dates between 1200 and 1600 AD. So it's right before the first Europeans arrive in the valley, and it's the last Native American group who were living there, and that's what it represents. All the kids were the students were all very happy upon finding that, because of course you find something on the first day, it encourages everyone to go on more. Now, if we didn't find that the first day, it would have been kind of a long field season, to put it bluntly. But in that same field, besides the projectile point that we found, we also found a piece of prehistoric cord-marked pottery. That cord-marked pottery probably dates to about the same time period as that projectile point. But they were found on the surface, which gives us really no context in which to sort of say, oh, we should open up test units here and excavate. Things are being plowed up in these fields, and stuff that sits on the top of the surface of the ground, we sort of lose that context from it. So one of the weird things that we had on our project was we had a mini microburst. We were doing excavations behind, this was a separate excavation at Hale Farm, but in a different location, at the Goldsmith house. And we were excavating a test unit. And this is in the middle of the day, and all of a sudden, a wind gust hit and took one of our 5-gallon buckets and lifted it about 25 feet in the air. And all of us just stood there with our mouths open. Couldn't believe that the wind picked this thing up. And it just spun around. It had to have been a sort of little mini microburst, which was really bizarre. Another sort of funny incident that we had too is, again, working in the same property, we did some shovel tests in this yard. So one of the other things that that was sort of funny was one of the students, Clem, who's been on my project for many, many years. There was a giant beehive in the field where we were working. It was a professional one, a unit set up. And everyone dared him to go sit on it. And he walked over and sat on it for about 2 minutes. And everyone, they bet on it that he wouldn't do it, and he did it. And not one, he wasn't stung, just never was stung once. One of the other things that was really important about what we did in other areas of the park, we worked in 2 other areas besides Field 4. We worked at the Goldsmith house, and we also worked at the Jaeger house. And we did geophysics in these areas. And geophysics we use a machine that allows us to look below the ground to look for magnetic anomalies. And so we set up a geophysical grid behind these 2 properties and looking for subsurface archaeological features. They produced 2 areas, which we then decided to excavate with test units. And they were both basically a bust. One was a rodent run. So at some point in the ancient or modern past, probably, a gopher or a rabbit or some other creature burrowed into the ground, a woodchuck burrowed in the ground and sort of left a hole in the ground, and it got filled in. And we discovered that. So it wasn't a cultural feature, it was an animal feature. So that was a bust. The other test unit that we dug actually provided a nice post mold for a prehistoric structure. But there were no artifacts in association with any of the stuff that we found there. So we couldn't really place it. We didn't know whether it was an ancient structure, or, to be honest, we needed more information to verify that, and we just didn't have it. The other thing about Hale Farm during the summer in August, the second weekend of August, they had a huge Civil War reenactment going on at the park. And walking around this reenactment, I realized that many of the cultural disturbances that we sort of noticed in our inventory testing could be accounted for by these past episodes of the Civil War reenactment. They've been doing it for like 20 years. And what we saw was that they were actually digging holes in the ground and making fire pits in them. And we found areas where we found charcoal like that, very close to the surface, suggesting that this is probably exactly what was going on. So these fire pits, or potential fire pits that we thought may be prehistoric, but didn't have any associated artifacts with them, were probably likely the results of these Civil War reenactors digging holes and having fires in them. So that sort of explained a lot of what we were finding and not finding, to be honest. So that was an important aspect too to sort of highlight. So when we were done excavating, all the materials, all the cultural materials came back here, in which they were all laid out by test unit and by level. That means each level in the ground that we excavated, we put artifacts out on trays. And then all the artifacts are carefully washed, they're cataloged, they're photographed, and they're inventoried. So we have a complete record of everything that was found here. The students were basically did all of that work. They did the washing, they did the cataloging, they typed out the catalog, the master catalog list, and I did most of the photography on it. And now we're just in the process of writing up what we found. So that's sort of that's really critical, the writing up of what we find, because as responsible archaeologists, we need to be able to disseminate the information that we find.